start. Hi, Urvashi. Thank you for joining me to talk about your work today. I'm really interested in hearing more about the kind of work you do in the field of early modern critical race studies, hearing more about your archive, and you work a lot with Shakespeare and queer theory and natality, and I'm especially interested in hearing about how those intersect with early modern critical race studies. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. It's really lovely to meet you, to learn more about your work, and it's just really exciting to see the different kinds of work and research being done. So thank you for making the time to speak with me. So there's a kind of chicken and egg problem with I think critical race studies and Shakespeare, right? Which is that when we think back to some of the work that was, say, done in the late 80s and 90s, there is kind of a truism which has arisen around maybe the last 25 years or so, 30 years of work in pre-modern critical race studies, that a lot of it is centered around Shakespeare. But when we think back to some of those texts, like Things of Darkness, to Hendricks and Parker, that edited volume, a lot of it was actually not about Shakespeare, right? So there's a way in which I think disciplinary considerations and the way the larger field evolved and what people were teaching and the kinds of disciplinary imperatives that were in place sort of led to a significant amount of that work taking place in and around Shakespeare. I think for me, what's really generative is sort of twofold. The first is obviously the kind of the sort of a kind of genealogy of critical possibility and interpretation, right? So and Shakespeare is sort of the place where a lot of these strains of inquiry and lines of inquiry meet. So it can be a kind of productive space for instance, queer theory and critical race studies, because often there has been a kind of interest from multiple directions around a clustered body of primary work. So that's sort of a kind of very sort of logistical, structural benefit perhaps to working on Shakespeare and thinking about Shakespeare, that it's such a fruitful field for so many different lines of inquiry that it becomes, I think, a really sort of productive body of work to think with. And it's obviously a body of work that is constantly being reimagined performatively and pedagogically, right? So that's one aspect of it. Mm-hmm. I would say that my own work has increasingly become more multi-generic over the past several years, right? So my first book is obviously has a certain amount of Shakespeare, but I would not say it's sort of a Shakespeare book. My second book certainly isn't. And there is a kind of, and I'm sure this is something you discussed as well in your class, there is a way in which there is now a kind of impetus to think about different lines of inquiry with regard to authors who perhaps have not been available to us in the past, right? So I'm thinking, Spencer, Milton, etc., but also non-Shakespearean drama. Although again, part of I think what I'm always struck by is how much of that early work was really invested in a kind of multi-generic body of primary literature. It's interesting to think about sort of what brought me to queer theory. If I had to sort of say two things about it, the first would be the tension I'm really interested in, or have always been interested in, is the way in which the presumptive whiteness of queer studies has evolved, and there is, I think, a sense of that in early modern queer studies as well, right? So versus those genealogies of queer theory, the role of Black feminism, the role of the Combi River Collective, right? All of those longer genealogies which are sort of written out of how we understand queer studies now. And so on the one hand, a consideration of queer studies and critical race studies is both overdue, and also they're co-articulated from the beginning. So I'm really, really interested in how certain kinds of critical genealogies have been written in and out of these fields. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think what really brought me to queer theory was thinking, and particularly thinking about the intersection of queer theory and early modern critical race studies, was actually thinking about the phenomenon of homonationalism, and the way in which particular kinds of, to put it really bluntly, particular kinds of solidarities also serve the ends of, in this case, white supremacy or whiteness, right? Or particular kinds of national ends, or particular kinds of, in this case, also sort of larger frameworks of Islamophobia, right? So how does that nexus of race and religion and sexuality and queerness sort of intersect, and how do they sort of work to elide the presumptive forms of power at their core?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's thank you for such a thorough answer. That really answers.
Sorry, that was really long and rambling. I apologize.
No, it answers so much of what I was wondering about, specifically, like what is it about queer studies and queer theory in particular that's so generative in dialogue with early modern critical race studies? And I think your answer unearths that it's not even a matter of being in dialogue, but these things are, like you said, co-articulated from the very beginning. And so it is important to, engage with these entanglements because they're already there. They're not being kind of artificially constructed. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was wondering if there's anything more you could say about maybe the specificity of, the way that queer theory reimagines and dislocates futurity as a project that is very much constituted with early modern critical race studies as well, specifically with the early modern period. I was just wondering if you could speak more about this very specific kind of like dislocating of futurity that you see so productive when thinking about Shakespeare and the formation of race and race thinking.
So I'm really glad you asked that, because I'm actually working right now on sort of ideas of racial futurity in early modern England, and part of what that arises out of is just this sort of amazingly generative and brilliant work on queer temporality and queer futurity, right? And so how does one imagine futures? Where does one imagine futures? It also, of course, comes out of my interest in antinatalism, in the ways in which reproductive futurity is both imagined and foreclosed. And what I find really generative in queer theory is, and particularly in sort of ideas of queer futurity, is the way in which it's sort of the conversation actually, and it's sort of an older conversation now, but it's one that I still find really productive around the racialized implications of thinking without or within particular modes of futurity and by extension temporality, right? So sort of to go back to that sort of older, larger point that Lee Edelman makes in No Future, right? Around the kind of refusal of the figure of the child, refusal of the figure of futurity, and the response which Munoz makes, which sort of points out the racialized implications of such refusal, and who gets to refuse, and what does it mean to think differently about notions of futurity. That's something that I've been thinking about, obviously, for a very long time. And at the moment, I'm sort of writing, both in sort of articles and in my second book, about what the implications those incredibly productive lines of inquiry might have, not just for the ways in which we think about sort of racial futurity today, but also for the kinds of futurity which are sort of always already racialized in early modern England. So when does white reproductive futurity become sort of possible or valorized or disavowed or foreclosed? What does it mean to imagine futures? What does it mean to imagine apocalyptic futures, right? Because those are sort of always already bound up with a particular mode of racial imaginary. And so this also, of course, has implications for representations of reproduction, and in a moment, I think, because I'm also really interested in sort of longer histories of slavery, I'm particularly interested in the ways in which this kind of racial imaginary of the future is bound up with these larger structures of enslavement and the kinds of real material forms of positing a future that both, I think, proposes and really challenges modes of sort of racial fixity or racial clarity, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, and this leads me to my next question, which is, I would like to hear more about your, so you have two book projects. I had a question about the book that's coming out in 2022 about, it's called Fictions of Consent, Slavery, Servitude, and Free Service in Early Modern England. And I was kind of interested in hearing more about the way that, so in your article on race, natality, and the biopolitics of early modern political theology, you talk about race being at the center of biopolitical formations of political theology. And I was interested in hearing more, like you just touched on the relationship between these changing conceptions of race, which lead to different biopolitical reorganizations in early modern England, because the meanings of bodies are changing in various ways, whether they're blood-based, somatic, phenotypical. And so how these kinds of rearticulations of racial bodies require reorganization in terms of political theology, and how exactly this constitutes a prehistory of slavery, like you say in your article, and then what that, how that relates to this book project. And then also this other book project that you're alluding to that I don't know about.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm so grateful to you for reading that article. You know, as you were talking, I was actually thinking of Naomi's brilliant article on Titus Andronicus in early theatre, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is so amazing about that essay, which I teach to my students, or which I read with my students, and I'm currently teaching a graduate course called Early Modern British Korean Studies, and we sort of read that earlier this term. And what I find, there's so much that's wonderful about it, but one of the things that is that I find particularly striking is the moment that she thinks about sort of Aaron's son called a slave, and how it relates to sort of Roman versus Iberian versus soon to be Atlantic notions around partis sequitur ventrum, right? And the kinds that, so I mentioned that because part of what my book is doing is thinking less about biopolitics or the body, actually. I think that will sort of come in again in my second book project, which is sort of about race and slavery and reproduction in the larger Atlantic world. And it's also trying to think about the way in which notions of white womanhood and white childhood are also constructed in this context. But what the first book is sort of doing is thinking about early modern ideologies of enslavement and slavery. And so what it's doing is thinking about the reception of, say, Roman ideas of slavery in the classroom, or Roman representations of slavery, and how they sort of lay the ideological and conceptual foundations for justifications and authorizations of racialized slavery. And so one of the things I'm also thinking about is the way in which, for instance, English subjects are sort of also being captured in Mediterranean contexts, and they're being redeemed. And yet what increasingly becomes the case, I suggest, is that a kind of permanent and heritable slavery does not attach to them, but it does attach to certain subjects over others. And so part of what I'm trying to trace is the inheritances of classical slavery to make those institutions not just thinkable, but possible, and also how the particular attachments of somatic and epidermal legibility only apply to certain kinds of bodies over others, right? So for certain kinds of bodies, that's that sort of stain of slavery, which is a term that I take from Roman ideas of slavery, where it's not bodily, where it's sort of a metaphor, it's sort of figurative rather than corporeal. That sort of that language becomes corporeal in the case of certain peoples over others. And so what the book is also doing is making a case, I hope, that the places where the ideologies of slavery have really sort of reaffirmed, are first sort of articulated and then repeatedly reaffirmed, are the kinds of everyday spaces of English life. So the grammar schoolroom where schoolboys might read and sort of read aloud Roman slave comedies, the space of the family, which I try to trace within this longer genealogy of slavery, and obviously the theatre itself, the household. So the sort of larger argument of the book is that that the kind of conceptual frameworks for slavery are actually seeded within these everyday relations, within these everyday spaces of early modern England, so that the work, the ideological work of slavery is embedded in English life and then activated sort of readily. And part of what I'm trying to do there is think about really the place and the, if I may say, the sort of culpability of these institutions, not as sort of neutral sites of service or of liberty, but as spaces where the kinds of prehistories of bondage are really being made and reaffirmed in these various ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's really interesting to hear about. I'm especially I'm wondering, do you deal with the kind of like religious dimensions of this bondage, the way that you do in the race, natality, and biopolitics article? Is that something that you deal with in your book as well?
I don't talk too much about it, although of course part of what part of that sort of originary language of free service, right? Service is perfect freedom, right? Is in the Book of Common Prayer. And so part of what I think is animating the book, or sort of when I think back to where the book began, was really in trying to think through that paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a long time, what I thought the book was about sort of modes of consensual service. And in some ways it still is. But it was sort of when I started to turn the dissertation into a book, and sort of a few years into that process, that I realized that what I was really writing was a book about bondage and slavery, right? And so the religious dimensions aren't sort of front and center in the way that they are in the article that you're mentioning. But of course, there is a really particular kind of theological mandate, if you will, that's also underwriting precisely the impulses that are complicit and very much animating the I mean, I would say the prehistories, except this becomes a running theme, of course, throughout the centuries of particularly Atlantic slavery, but which is certainly animating these kinds of logics of bondage that are being articulated and reaffirmed and shored up, sort of, as I said, in these kinds of quotidian contexts.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for answering all of my questions. This has been really illuminating, especially thinking about how, figures like Shakespeare that seem so kind of like concrete sometimes. It seems like there's not more work to be done because everything that could have been written has been written, but that's absolutely not true. I think as your work testifies, and your work has also been really interesting for me thinking about the productivity of anachronisms, or so-called anachronisms, and the ways in which thinking backwards and thinking forwards can be done productively using contemporary terms that seem out of place for the past, but can actually like illuminate it and reconstitute it in meaningful ways. And so this conversation has been really helpful to continue thinking about that, especially with early modern critical race studies. So again, thank you so much for taking the time and talking about your work. It was really fascinating.
Thank you so much for talking with me. And I'm really excited to learn more about your work. And if there's one thing I would maybe just add, it's that genealogies are really useful. Not just not just as useful for me, not just as a term, but also I think as a methodology. I'm really, really interested in sort of thinking about how, put in its most simplistic way, sort of how we got here. How do we get to a place where there can be these persistent British fictions that there was no slavery, etc. But I try to think with genealogy around the problem of anachronism. And I'm really excited to learn more about your work and read more of it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll stop the recording now and chat for a bit.